Welcome! You're listening to the Uncharted Lancaster podcast, where we explore the hidden histories, forgotten places, and long-buried secrets of Lancaster County. Using modern digital storytelling tools, each episode brings a new piece of local lore to life, revealing the strange, the surprising, and the stories history left behind. Let's begin.
Picture the absolute coldest day you can possibly imagine in early March 1904.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's setting a scene.
Right. So you are standing on the banks of the Susquehanna River, and you're in this bustling, blue-collar town in Pennsylvania.
Mm-hmm.
And it has been a brutally cold winter. I mean, the river hasn't just frozen over. It's formed this armored plate of solid ice, 2 feet thick, just stretching from shore to shore.
2 feet of ice, that's substantial.
It really is. And then the spring rains arrive.
Oh, boy.
Yeah, exactly. So the water level begins to rise underneath that massive sheet of ice, and the sheer hydraulic pressure just shatters the ice into these gargantuan, jagged flows.
Right, iceberg-sized, basically.
Literally, some the size of small buildings. And these flows begin to march downriver, grinding against the banks, picking up speed until they hit a narrow bottleneck.
And let me guess, they jam.
They jam. In a matter of minutes, this snag creates a temporary makeshift dam made entirely out of jagged ice.
Which is terrifying, because a river that drains half the state of Pennsylvania suddenly has nowhere to go.
Nowhere at all. The water level behind this ice dam rises 10 feet in 5 minutes.
Wow. I mean, the kinetic energy involved in an event like that is almost impossible to wrap your head around.
Right.
You are talking about millions of tons of water and ice acting as a sheer lateral wrecking ball.
And it was a wrecking ball. I mean, the water and the iceberg-sized chunks backed up into the mouth of the Conestoga River, and they completely smothered a town called Safe Harbor.
Just wiped it out.
Yeah. 79 homes were crushed or flooded. A massive stone arch railroad bridge was actually lifted off its foundations by the buoyant force of the ice.
Lift it right up?
Lifted right up, snapped like it was made of dry twigs, and dropped into the churning water.
That's unbelievable.
By the time the ice gorge finally broke and the water receded, the town of Safe Harbor was effectively erased from the map.
It's a terrifying testament to the untamable nature of a river. Or, well, at least what we thought was untamable.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are taking a massive stack of sources.
And it's quite a stack.
Oh, totally. We've got geographical surveys, historical records, and this genuinely fascinating 1934 engineering thesis written by a guy named Edward Preston Rahe.
That thesis is a gold mine, honestly.
It really is. And we're using all this to unpack the story of the Safe Harbor Dam.
Right.
We're looking at how a completely unnavigable, boat-killing river that literally wiped a town off the map was somehow harnessed to power the entire eastern seaboard.
Right, because the overarching narrative here is the evolution of human ambition. For centuries, people looked at the Susquehanna and tried to force it to do things it was geographically incapable of doing.
They wanted it to be this gentle, reliable shipping lane.
Yeah, and the river violently rejected that. But the fascinating turn of fate is that the exact same geological features that made the Susquehanna a nightmare for boats.
The rapids and all that.
Exactly. Those features eventually made it an absolute gold mine for hydroelectricity.
So to understand the dam, we really first have to understand the beast it was built to contain.
The river itself.
Yeah, the Susquehanna River is not a normal waterway. It is massive. It drains an area of more than 27,000 square miles.
Which is huge.
Right, starting way up at Lake Otsego in central New York, winding down through the anthracite coal region of Pennsylvania, and finally dumping into the Chesapeake Bay.
And the output is just staggering. I mean, it's the largest single source of fresh water flowing into the Chesapeake Bay.
It supplies 50% of the fresh water entering the bay, right?
Yeah. Half the water for one of the largest estuaries in the country comes from this one single river.
But despite all of that water, it holds this, deeply frustrating title for early American settlers. It is the longest non-commercially navigable river in the country.
Which drove him crazy.
Oh, completely. And the reason for this goes back to an incredible geological anomaly. Normally, if you think about how a river works, it starts high in the mountains.
Right. You get steep drops, waterfalls, white water near the source.
Yeah. Then as it gets closer to the ocean, it levels out, becomes broad, deep, and just meanders lazily into the sea.
But the Susquehanna does the exact opposite.
It does.
Geologically speaking, it's actually one of the oldest rivers in the world, older than the Appalachian Mountains it flows through.
Wait, older than the mountains?
Yeah, it predates the mountain uplift. So for most of its journey, it's broad, incredibly shallow, and lazy.
Mm-hmm.
But right at the end of its journey, as it approaches the Chesapeake, it hits this geological boundary called the fall line.
Okay, what happens there?
That's where the harder rock of the Piedmont Plateau meets the softer sediment of the coastal plain.
Ah, okay. So instead of a gentle slope to the ocean, the river suddenly drops off a geological cliff.
Exactly.
It plunges 1,180 feet in elevation from its headwaters to the bay, but like a massive percentage of that drop happens in just the last 55 miles.
Which is incredibly sudden.
Yeah, the river is squeezed into this deep, quarter-mile wide canyon-like gorge, and it drops about 6 feet every single mile.
So the water is forced over jagged rocks, creating treacherous rapids and small waterfalls. It's basically an absolute graveyard for the hulls of wooden boats.
Just smashing them to pieces.
Right. And that intense drop is pure kinetic energy. It was entirely useless for commercial shipping, but as we'll see, it was a hydro engineer's dream.
But the steep drop wasn't the only problem, right? The river was also incredibly volatile.
Oh, incredibly.
Yeah, I found the data in Edward Preston Rahe's 1934 thesis to be mind-blowing. He submitted this to the Maryland Beta chapter of Tau Beta Pi, by the way.
Yeah, he extensively documents the river's mood swings.
Like during the severe drought of 1930, the river's flow dropped to just 2,000 cubic feet per second.
Which, for a river spanning a quarter mile wide means you could practically walk across it just by hopping on rocks.
Right. But then Rahi contrasts that with the Great Flood of 1889.
Oh, that was a monster.
Yeah, during that event, the water thundered down the gorge above Port Deposit at a rate of 726,000 cubic feet per second.
So it goes from 2,000 to 726,000. That's a multiplier of over 360.
It's insane. Imagine turning on your kitchen faucet to get a glass of water, right? And instead of a gentle stream, it suddenly blasts out with the force of an industrial water cannon.
It's just blowing a hole straight through your floor.
Exactly, like blasting straight into the basement. How do you build a reliable commercial port on a river that behaves like that?
The rational answer is that you don't.
You really don't.
But, early 19th century American businessmen were not easily deterred by geography.
No, they were not.
They saw water and immediately assumed they could turn it into money.
Which introduces the area known as Safe Harbor. And the name itself is, it's somewhat debated by historians.
Yeah.
But our sources point to two main theories.
The first one is pretty practical.
Right. The Conestoga River flows into the Susquehanna at this exact spot. And because the Susquehanna is so treacherous, the deep, relatively calm waters at the mouth of the Conestoga provided a literal safe harbor.
It was a place where rivermen, guiding log rafts downstream, could pull over and just catch their breath before they had to face the truly deadly rapids further south.
Like a temporary refuge before you enter the gauntlet.
Exactly.
But the second theory is just sheer, unadulterated hubris.
Oh, it's so funny.
It involves the Conestoga Navigation Company and their plan to turn the city of Lancaster into an international seaport.
Lancaster, Pennsylvania.
Yes.
A city that is completely landlocked.
It is 102 miles away from the Atlantic Ocean.
That makes no sense.
None. But in the early 1800s, investors looked at a map and thought, hey, we have the Conestoga River. It connects to the Susquehanna, which connects to the Chesapeake Bay. Let's dig a canal.
Naturally.
So in 1802, they started constructing an 18-mile slackwater canal system down the Conestoga to Safe Harbor.
And we should probably define what a slackwater canal actually is, because it explains why this was so difficult.
Yeah, please do.
So a slackwater system involves building a series of dams across a shallow river to intentionally pool the water behind them, making it deep enough for boats.
Okay.
And then you build locks to raise and lower the boats past the dam.
Right. And they built 9 locks and dams just to get to Safe Harbor.
9 of them.
Yeah. The plan was that boats would hit Safe Harbor, transitioned into the Susquehanna and Tidewater Canal, and ride all the way down to Maryland.
And the marketing pitch from the promoters in the 1830s was absolutely delusional.
Oh, I love this part. What did they claim?
They claimed you could board a ship in landlocked Lancaster and sail continuously until you disembarked in Paris, France.
Paris. From Lancaster.
It is pure speculative marketing. I mean, there is zero historical evidence that any ship ever made that journey.
Soccer.
Yeah, the Enterprise was an absolute money pit. Building dams in a river system prone to apocalyptic flooding meant the infrastructure was constantly being washed away.
Of course.
It limped along for a few decades before the invention of the railroad mercifully put the canal out of business.
It reminds me of the New Philadelphia plan. William Penn, the founder of Pennsylvania, had the exact same delusion.
He did, yeah.
Penn wanted to build this massive rival city to Philadelphia on a 3,000-acre site in Manor Township, right near this same stretch of the river.
He just assumed he could dredge and widen the Conestoga River to create a massive harbor for ocean-going ships coming up from the Chesapeake.
Right, because he saw the success of Philadelphia on the Delaware River and just assumed the Susquehanna operated under the same physical laws.
He had no idea about the gorge.
No clue.
He had no idea about the fault line.
None. The river violently rejected these commercial shipping dreams. But human industry adapts, right?
Yes.
Because the river was too violent for boats, the locals abandoned the shipping dream and looked to the earth instead. And they found something buried in the mud that birthed an entirely different kind of boomtown.
Ah, the Iron Era.
Yes. In 1846, this quiet rural refuge at the mouth of the Conestoga changes practically overnight. A company out of Philadelphia, Reeves Abbott and Company, arrives. They have discovered massive deposits of iron ore in the immediate vicinity.
Okay.
And they realize that even though the canals failed to make Lancaster a seaport, those same canals are perfectly adequate for moving heavy bulk freight like iron ore and coal locally.
And the timing on that was just impeccable.
How so?
Well, the Pennsylvania Railroad was expanding rapidly across the state, and they desperately needed T-shaped iron rails.
Of course.
So Reeves Abbott and Company decided to build a colossal ironworks right at Safe Harbor to feed that demand.
But turning raw iron ore into a usable railroad track in the 1840s, that required a very specific type of brutal, highly skilled labor.
It was incredibly tough work.
Yeah. The company actually sent recruiters across the Atlantic to Ireland, right in the midst of the devastating potato famine, to hire desperate men. They were looking for puddlers.
And the chemistry and the physical toll of puddling are really essential to understand here.
Yeah. Can you explain what they were actually doing?
Sure. So when you smelt raw iron ore in a blast furnace, the resulting product is called pig iron.
Okay.
Pig iron absorbs a lot of carbon from the coal and coke used in the furnace, usually around 4% carbon.
Which sounds like a small amount, but I'm guessing it matters.
It matters a lot. That high carbon content makes pig iron incredibly brittle. If you hit a pig iron rail with a heavy hammer, it will shatter like glass.
Wow. So you certainly can't run a 40-ton steam locomotive over it.
Precisely. To make the iron malleable and tough enough for rails, you have to remove that carbon. You have to turn it into wrought iron.
And how did they do that before modern steelmaking?
Well, before modern automated steelmaking, the only way to do that was puddling. A puddler would stand in front of a specialized reverberatory furnace, dealing with just unimaginable blistering heat.
Oh, sounds awful.
It was. They used a long iron rod called a rabble to manually stir a pool of molten pig iron.
Literally stirring liquid metal by hand.
Yes. And by stirring it, they exposed the molten iron to the oxygen in the air rushing through the furnace. The oxygen bonds with the carbon in the iron, burning it off as carbon dioxide gas.
That's fascinating.
And as the carbon content drops, the melting point of the iron actually rises. The liquid iron slowly turns into a spongy, sticky, semi-solid mass.
Oh, weird.
Yeah. And then the puddler has to use immense physical strength to gather this glowing, heavy mass of iron onto the end of his rod, pull it out of the furnace, and get it to a steam hammer to beat the slag out of it.
My God.
It was grueling, dangerous, life-shortening work.
And Reeves Abbott and Company needed hundreds of these men. So to house them, they essentially built a town from scratch.
Just threw up a whole town.
Pretty much. They erected over 70 duplex frame dwellings, laying out a grid of arrow-straight streets with names like Walnut, Cedar, Spring, and Race.
Very standard company town names.
Yeah. But I found this architectural detail really fascinating. These duplexes were built with massive shared central chimneys.
Oh, right.
Yeah. The families living on either side of the duplex would share the hearth for heating and cooking. So Safe Harbor went from this quiet riverbank to a booming, smoky industrial town of 1,200 people.
And the sheer scale of the manufacturing was monumental for the mid-19th century.
How big was it?
The main rolling mill was a colossal structure covering over an acre of ground. Inside, they were passing those hot, spongy masses of iron through massive mechanical rollers, squeezing them into the exact T-shape required for the railroad.
Wow.
Yeah, at its peak, the Safe Harbor Ironworks produced 1/8 of all the rolled iron in the entire state of Pennsylvania.
1/8 of the whole state. It must have been incredibly lucrative.
Oh, absolutely.
But then, in 1861, the Civil War breaks out, Railroad expansion basically halts, and the Union Army desperately needs heavy artillery.
So the ironworks pivots.
Right. They stop making rails and start making naval cannons. Specifically, this very bizarre-looking weapon called the Dahlgren gun.
The Dahlgren gun is a really fascinating chapter in military engineering.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was designed by Rear Admiral John A. Dahlgren. Prior to his work, cannons were largely designed through trial and error.
Which seems dangerous.
It was. In 1849, a standard 32-pounder naval cannon was being fired during a test, and it violently exploded. A piece of the breech blew off and actually killed a gunner.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so Dahlgren realized that with the increasing power of gunpowder, they needed actual scientific design criteria.
And this comes down to internal ballistics, right?
Yes, exactly. When the gunpowder inside a cannon ignites, it doesn't burn evenly. There's a massive instantaneous spike in pressure right at the back of the gun, the breech where the explosion happens.
Okay, that makes sense.
As the cannonball moves down the barrel, the volume behind it increases, so the pressure rapidly drops off. Dahlgren mapped out this pressure curve.
So his solution was to just put the metal where the pressure was.
Right.
The Dahlgren guns cast at Safe Harbor were incredibly thick and bulbous at the breech to contain that initial explosion, and then they smoothly curved and tapered down toward the muzzle where the pressure was lower.
And the smooth curves were intentional.
Oh, they were.
Yeah, sharp angles or steps in the metal create stress concentrations where cracks can form. By making the gun smooth and contoured, he equalized the strain across the entire casting.
But the troops, however, didn't really care about the physics.
No, they didn't.
They just thought the cannons looked ridiculous. Because of that thick bottom and tapered top, they nicknamed them soda bottles.
Soda bottle, yes.
And Safe Harbor was churning these massive soda bottles out by the dozen for the Union Navy.
And with that massive output came massive wages.
Yes, it did.
Which leads to a very predictable sociological outcome for a town of 1,200 young men working in front of blast furnaces all day.
Right. They needed to blow off steam, and boy, did they.
I can imagine.
The historical records show that by 1851, Safe Harbor boasted 5 taverns, 3 liquor stores, and 6 beer halls.
Wow.
It was widely documented as the booziest town anywhere in the county.
It was a classic boomtown economy, you know? High danger, high reward, high consumption.
But the boomtown was living on borrowed time because they were entirely reliant on the river and the canals to move their raw materials and their finished massive cannons.
Which, as we know, is a risky bet.
Extremely.
Huh.
In the spring of 1865, just weeks before General Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox to end the Civil War, the Susquehanna showed its teeth again. A devastating flood tore through the valley.
And that floodwaters wiped out the canal facilities along both the Conestoga and the Susquehanna.
Just leveled them.
It destroyed the vital bridges. In an era before motorized trucking, a heavy industry factory cannot survive without water or rail logistics. The cost to rebuild the canal system was simply too high.
So without a way to transport the iron, the furnaces went cold. The ironworks sat completely idle for 12 years.
That's a long time.
Yeah, they attempted a brief revival in 1877 on a much smaller scale, and even converted some buildings into a factory making blue-tipped phosphorus matches. But by 1894, the industrial heart of Safe Harbor was permanently shuttered.
The industry died, but the physical town, you know, the grid of streets, the duplexes, the families who had put down roots, they remained.
They just stayed.
Yeah, they transitioned to farming or found work elsewhere. The community lingered.
Until that terrifying morning in March 1904.
Right. Back to the ice.
We started this deep dive with the ice gorge, and now you know exactly who was in its path. When that ice gorge broke, it didn't just flood empty marshland. It unleashed a wall of frozen destruction onto those 70 duplexes.
It's devastating.
The families who had lived there for generations had to scramble under their shared roofs just to survive as iceberg-sized chunks of the Susquehanna smashed their living rooms to splinters.
And the devastation was absolute. The houses were so structurally compromised by the crushing weight of the ice that they were officially condemned.
Right.
A few years later, the remains of the homes were sold off for salvaged lumber at just $30 apiece.
$30. Today, if you visit the mouth of the Conestoga, it is essentially a ghost town. Yeah, almost nothing remains of the booziest town in the county. There are only 3 real remnants.
What's left?
First, there's the breathtaking Ironmaster's house, which is this massive stone mansion perched high on a hill, safe from the floods. It was actually built in 1725, so it predated the ironworks entirely.
Oh, wow. And what else?
There was also the Oddfellows Hall, a brick building from 1848 that managed to survive.
Right. Over the decades, it served as a lodge for the Independent Order of Odd Fellows, a meeting place for Freemasons.
Yeah, and eventually the second floor was converted into the Safe Harbor Independent School District, serving the children of the farmers who stayed behind.
That's pretty resilient.
It is. And then, deeply hidden in a clearing in the woods, slowly being reclaimed by the forest, is the foundation of St. Mary's Immaculate Conception Catholic Church.
Oh, the church the Irish puddlers built.
Yes, back in 1854. The church itself was actually bulldozed in 1985 because the masonry was crumbling and it became a public hazard. All that is left today is a pedestal of salvaged stones and the cemetery.
The cemetery is a really somber physical record of the labor it took to tame this region.
It really is.
Alongside the graves of Civil War veterans who returned home to work the furnaces, there's a section containing the unmarked graves of at least 50 Italian immigrants.
Right. They died later on, performing grueling manual labor to construct the nearby Enola low-grade rail line. So the town was gone, erased. For over 2 decades, the banks of the Susquehanna at Safe Harbor were just quiet. The river had won.
So it seemed.
Right, because a new generation of visionaries was looking at that unnavigable, hyperviolent gorge not as a problem, but as an unparalleled source of kinetic energy.
Yeah, the transition from the Iron Age to the Electrical Age required a completely different approach to the river.
You didn't need it to carry boats anymore.
Exactly. You no longer needed the river to carry boats. You needed the river to spin turbines.
But building a hydroelectric dam is one of the most capital-intensive projects humans undertake.
Very expensive.
Extremely. And the developers behind the Safe Harbor Dam decided to pull the trigger on financing this mega project at literally the worst possible time in American economic history.
To understand the audacity of the timing, we really have to look slightly downriver.
Okay, let's do that.
Safe Harbor wasn't the first attempt to dam the lower Susquehanna. In the early 1900s, developers started building the McCall's Ferry Dam, which was later renamed the Holtwood Dam.
And they went spectacularly bankrupt, right?
They did, yeah. Our thesis source, Rahi, points out that the turn of the century was an era where, quote, hydroelectric enthusiasm was greater than hydroelectric experience.
That's a great way to put it.
It is. The massive success of the power plant at Niagara Falls had whipped investors into a frenzy. They assumed any big waterfall could print money.
Just add water and get rich.
Exactly. But the Susquehanna's unpredictable flow and the sheer difficulty of building in the gorge caught the McCall's ferry investors totally off guard. The project ran out of money and went into receivership.
Wait, hold on. If the first dam in the gorge went bankrupt, how did anyone convince investors to fund a second, even larger dam just a few miles upstream?
Because a man named J.E. Aldred stepped in.
Okay, who's that?
In 1909, Aldred took over the bankrupt McCall's Ferry project as the receiver. He restructured the finances, organized the Pennsylvania Water and Power Company, brought in competent engineers.
Nice.
And by 1910, the plant was completely finished and successfully delivering electrical power across transmission lines all the way to Baltimore.
Wow.
Yeah, he proved the gorge should be conquered and, more importantly, that it could be profitable.
Ah, okay. So Aldred proves the concept. And the industrial demand in Baltimore, which is just booming with manufacturing, is growing so fast that Holtwood's output simply isn't enough.
Right. They needed more juice.
So the company starts planning a new, massive development upstream to act as a sister plant. This new development is Safe Harbor.
And the planning and geological surveys for Safe Harbor started in late 1929.
Late 1929. Oh, boy.
The parent company covered the preliminary engineering costs. But by June 1930, they needed this massive infusion of capital to actually buy the concrete, steel, and labor. They needed to issue $21 million in bonds.
I need to interject here because the timeline is staggering.
It's crazy.
June 1930. The stock market crashed in October 1929.
Right.
The global economy is in an absolute freefall. Banks are collapsing. How on earth do you market $21 million in corporate bonds when the Great Depression is actively ripping the country apart?
It is a phenomenal piece of financial timing and, really, market psychology.
How did they do it?
Well, in the immediate aftermath of the 1929 crash, investors were terrified of speculative stocks. They were desperately looking for safe havens for whatever capital they had left.
Okay, that makes sense.
Utility bonds, especially backed by a company that already had a proven track record with the Holtwood Dam and guaranteed contracts to supply power to the city of Baltimore, were viewed as highly secure.
So they essentially marketed these bonds as a life raft for terrified investors.
Exactly. And they managed to sell the entire $21 million bond issue at a yield of nearly 4.5%.
Ah.
And Rahe notes in his thesis that they pulled this off mere weeks before the bond market itself suffered a massive secondary slump that would have made the sale totally impossible.
So the window was closing rapidly, and they slipped through just in time.
Just in time.
And the irony is, once they had the money in the bank, the sheer devastation of the Great Depression actually became the greatest asset the project had.
It's a grim macroeconomic reality, yeah.
Yeah.
Rahe states it plainly in his analysis. The Depression was put to good advantage. Because the global economy had basically halted, there was absolutely zero competition for raw materials.
Right.
Steel, copper, lumber, and cement were available at prices massively below their 1929 levels.
And the labor market was just flooded with desperate men.
Oh, completely. The project cost roughly $30 million total, which is nearly $500 million in today's money. And of that, $10 million was paid out directly in wages. Thousands of men from across the country flocked to the Susquehanna Gorge looking for work.
Just looking for anything.
At the peak of construction, there were 4,000 men working on the dam.
4,000?
Yeah, the company had their pick of highly skilled laborers who normally would have commanded premium wages but were now willing to work for standard rates just to feed their families. Turnover was virtually non-existent.
And with 4,000 men suddenly descending on the quiet ruins of the old iron town, history repeated itself in the most ironic way possible.
Oh, this part is great.
It really is. Most of these workers lived in temporary bunkhouses and shanties built in the ravines surrounding the construction site.
And a massive influx of transient labor always brings a shadow economy with it.
Always. The local residents, the farmers who were descendants of the ironworkers, were absolutely scandalized by the behavior of the dam workers.
Scandalized.
They actually drafted a formal petition and sent it to the district attorney. The petition demanded police intervention, complaining that, quote, bootleg whiskey is being sold openly and freely, and that gambling is rampant.
Which is profoundly ironic.
It's hilarious.
Yeah.
They completely forgot that just 79 years earlier, their own grandparents were living in the booziest town in the county, running 5 taverns and 6 beer halls.
It's an incredible case of generational amnesia.
Truly. They were furious that these dam builders were doing exactly what the iron puddlers had done a lifetime ago.
But the Safe Harbor Water Power Corporation knew that a mega project of this scale couldn't just rely on transient labor living in shanties forever.
Right.
Once the dam was finished, it would require a highly trained, permanent staff of engineers, mechanics, and administrators to run the complex machinery.
And you have to convince those highly educated professionals to move to a remote river gorge.
Exactly. So they didn't just build a dam, they built an entire luxury neighborhood.
I love this detail.
Yeah, they constructed the village at Safe Harbor. This was not a cheap clapboard company town. They hired prominent architects to design a meticulously planned English Tudor-style village. It is such a striking juxtaposition. You have this brutal, massive concrete dam, and sitting on the hillside right above it is a quaint, high-end Tudor village.
It's wild. They built 21 brick and half-timber single-family homes with slate roofs.
Mm-hmm.
They built a bachelor quarters apartment building for the unmarried engineers. They even built a multi-purpose building that housed a grocery store, a post office, and a formal ballroom with hardwood floors for the community to host dances.
A ballroom at a dam. It was a massive investment in employee retention.
And that investment highlights how strategically critical this infrastructure was. The power generated by Safe Harbor wasn't just keeping the lights on in Baltimore. It was powering the massive industrial shipyards and the electrified railroads.
Right, which became very important later on. Right. It was so vital to the national interest that immediately following the attack on Pearl Harbor in World War II, the U.S. military realized Safe Harbor was a prime target.
Wait. Adolf Hitler knew about a dam in rural Pennsylvania?
The Axis Command certainly knew about the power grids supplying the East Coast war machine.
Wow.
Sabotaging Safe Harbor would have crippled the logistical rail network transporting steel and weapons to the Atlantic ports.
So what did they do?
To prevent this, the U.S. military deployed actual combat troops to Safe Harbor.
No way.
Yeah, they set up anti-aircraft guns on the hills, and the soldiers were quartered right there in the Tudor village, literally sleeping in the ballroom to protect the dam.
That is incredible. But let's go back to 1930.
Right, back to the build.
They have the money, they have the labor, and they have the plans. But before they can pour 500,000 cubic yards of concrete into the riverbed and flood the valley behind the dam, they have to deal with the history buried in the mud.
because the construction of a dam creates a permanent reservoir. The valley behind Safe Harbor, known as the Conowelhella Valley, was about to be submerged under 50 feet of water forever.
Forever.
And the power company understood that this area was rich in Native American history.
So they funded a massive rescue archaeology mission.
Which was surprisingly forward-thinking for 1930.
It really was. They brought in a highly respected archaeologist named Dr. Donald Cadzow. For over a year, Cadzow and his team painstakingly excavated the islands and the shorelines that were slated to be flooded.
And the discoveries fundamentally altered our understanding of the indigenous populations of the region. They uncovered the deep history of the Susquehanna and Algonquin tribes.
The sources emphasized the sheer volume of the artifacts, too.
Oh, yeah. They found hundreds of intact earth and clay pots recovered from ancient burials and kitchen sites.
And this was a massive revelation because up until that point, historians and anthropologists largely believed the Susquehannocks were a tribe that didn't extensively produce or use pottery.
Exactly. This dig proved they had a rich, complex ceramic tradition.
What else did they find?
Cadzow also recovered implements of war, tools made of carved bone and polished stone, and the charred, preserved remains of corn and beans.
Which is so cool.
Yeah, which provided clear evidence of their agricultural practices and diet.
Even more remarkably, the team documented and extracted a massive quantity of ancient Native American picture rocks, petroglyphs, that were carved into the massive boulders in the riverbed.
That must have been tough to move.
Seriously.
Yeah.
Academics from all over the country visited the Safe Harbor dig and declared that Dr. Cadzow had unearthed a record of Native American life unequaled anywhere on the Atlantic seaboard.
That's a huge claim.
Right. The power company paid for the entire expedition, and the artifacts were sent to the State Museum in Harrisburg for permanent preservation.
It was a vital, respectful pause, but once the artifacts were safe, the brutal, deafening work of altering the Earth's geology began.
And this is where the engineering logistics just shatter my mind.
It is quite the puzzle.
How do you build a concrete wall that is 5,000 feet long and 75 feet tall, deeply anchored into the bedrock, while a river that drained half of Pennsylvania is actively flowing over the site?
You can't just turn the Susquehanna off.
Right. You can't unplug it.
You cannot turn it off, but you can squeeze it. The engineering solution is the cofferdam.
Okay, walk us through that.
A cofferdam is a temporary watertight enclosure built directly into the river. You build the walls of the enclosure, and then you use massive industrial pumps to suck all the water out of the inside.
So it's like a dry room in the middle of a river.
Exactly. This exposes the dry bedrock of the river bottom, allowing your men to drill, blast, and pour concrete foundations without needing scuba gear.
Okay, but how do you actually build a watertight box on a jagged, rocky riverbed while the water is actively rushing past you?
It requires immense precision and brute force. At Safe Harbor, they utilized timber crib cofferdams.
Timber cribs.
Yeah, they essentially built massive interlocking wooden boxes out of heavy timber right on the shore. They would float these wooden boxes out into the river, position them, and then fill them with hundreds of tons of crushed rock.
Ah, so the weight sinks them.
Right. The weight of the rock sinks the wooden cribs down until they literally smash into the bedrock.
But wood and rocks aren't watertight. Water would just flow right through the gaps.
That is where the puddle core comes in.
A cold core.
Once the cribs were sunk, the engineers brought in thousands of tons of impermeable clay. They packed this clay thickly along the outside of the wooden cribs.
Oh, I see.
And the immense hydrostatic pressure of the river pushing against the clay forced it into every single crack and crevice of the wood and the uneven bedrock, creating a surprisingly tight seal.
That is brilliant.
Yeah.
So the process at Safe Harbor happened in two massive phases, right?
Correct.
First, they built these cofferdams connecting the eastern shore to a large landmass in the middle of the river called Ellis Island.
Mm-hmm.
This massive wooden and clay barricade blocked the entire eastern half of the river, forcing all 27,000 square miles of watershed drainage to squeeze through the western channel.
And with the eastern channel pumped dry, the crews just swarmed in. They blasted into the bedrock to anchor the foundations, and they began pouring the concrete for the massive powerhouse and the eastern half of the spillway dam.
Okay, so once that east side was built, they essentially performed a massive plumbing switch.
They did.
They built new cofferdams on the western side, drawing out a 700-foot section. But where did the water go?
They routed the river right through the newly constructed east side.
Oh, wow.
The water flowed partly through the lower sections of the new powerhouse and partly through temporary gaps called closure slots that they intentionally left open in the eastern spillway concrete.
And this is where the sheer, unadulterated luck of the project comes into play. Rahi calls it good fortune in his thesis, but it honestly borders on the miraculous.
It really does.
During the summer of 1930, when they were desperately trying to build these cofferdams and pump the riverbed dry, they needed low water. If the river flooded, it would overtop the cofferdams and wash the work crews away.
And nature provided perfectly. The summer of 1930 saw one of the most severe droughts in recorded history. The river flow dropped to that miserable 2,000 cubic feet per second.
That we talked about earlier.
Exactly. The beast was entirely subdued exactly when the engineers needed it to be.
But the luck didn't stop there. Fast forward to late 1931. The massive concrete structure is largely finished. The massive steel turbines are installed.
Okay.
Now, to generate electricity, they have to close the temporary slots, let the water back up behind the dam to form a 53-foot deep lake, and test the machinery. They need massive amounts of water.
And in a normal year, it would have taken months for the river to slowly fill a 7,300-acre reservoir.
But instead, the skies opened up. Torrential, record-breaking heavy rains hammered the watershed.
Just unbelievable timing.
The river swelled, roared down the gorge, and filled the reservoir months ahead of the most optimistic engineering schedules.
Wow.
Because of that perfect weather, timing a drought when they needed dry land, a flood when they needed water, the first turbine started revolving in December 1931. That is just 20 months after they poured the first concrete.
Constructing a mile-long concrete mega-project in 20 months is a logistical triumph. I mean, the sheer volume of material moving around the site is staggering. They placed over 500,000 cubic yards of concrete.
500,000 cubic yards. Where do you even get the rock for that?
Well, you find it locally, if you are lucky. And they were. Geological surveys found a massive trap rock dike just 1 mile east of the dam site.
Let's break that down, because trap rock dike sounds like a geological booby trap. What exactly is it, and why is it good for concrete?
Okay, so a dike is an intrusion of igneous rock, magma, that pushed its way up through cracks in the Earth's crust millions of years ago and cooled very slowly beneath the surface. The specific rock here is diabase. Because it cooled slowly, it formed a densely interlocking network of mineral crystals. It is incredibly hard and incredibly durable.
Well, why is that better for concrete than any other rock?
Because when you crush diabase, it doesn't break into flat, smooth, flaky pieces like shale or slate. It breaks into angular, chunky, rough pieces.
And those rough, angular edges are exactly what the liquid cement needs to grip onto to create structurally sound mass concrete, right?
Precisely. It is the perfect aggregate. So the engineers essentially attacked this hill. They gouged 2.3 million cubic yards of rock out of the hillside.
Just carved it out.
Yeah, they built a massive, multi-story rock crushing plant right at the quarry, grinding the diabase down to the perfect size. Then they laid down a specialized short-line railroad track running right down the ravine to haul the crushed rock directly to the river.
And to mix it, they built a colossal, centralized concrete mixing plant right in the middle of the river on Ellis Island.
Just massive scale.
Right. This wasn't guys with the wheelbarrows. This was an automated scientific operation. Every single ingredient, the crushed trap rock, the sand, the cement, the water, was automatically measured by exact weight to ensure that every single batch of concrete had the exact same structural strength.
Once it was mixed, they had to deliver it to the forms. So they erected a massive temporary steel bridge running perfectly parallel to the dam.
Right.
This bridge carried 3 standard gauge railroad tracks for supply trains, plus a massive 40-foot gauge track built specifically for the crane.
Cranes. Our sources detail 4 main cranes. There were 2 50-ton cranes and 2 absolute leviathans, 150-ton gantry cranes equipped with massive derricks and concrete shooting towers.
It's absolute monsters.
Yeah, these machines were picking up massive steel buckets of wet concrete, swinging them out over the riverbed and dropping them into the wooden forms. They were also lifting the 20,000 tons of structural steel and the 6,300 tons of reinforcing rebar required to hold the dam together.
And here is a really fascinating detail regarding redundancy. If you have a bucket carrying tons of wet concrete swinging through the air, you cannot afford a sudden power outage.
No, that would be disastrous.
Right. The cranes were electric, but what if the grid from the nearby Holtwood plant failed?
What would they do?
The engineers installed a massive backup gasoline engine directly onto one of the 150-ton cranes. If the power dropped, the gasoline engine would instantly kick in, ensuring they could safely lower the load.
They left nothing to chance.
Nothing at all.
They tamed the Susquehanna.
Right.
But a 5,000-foot concrete wall is just a barrier.
Right.
A wall doesn't turn the lights on in Baltimore. To transform a river into an economic engine, you need machinery. You need some of the most sophisticated, massive mechanical engineering of the 20th century. So how exactly does Safe Harbor turn a river into electricity?
It all relies on the conversion of potential energy into kinetic energy and then into electrical energy. Engineers of the era poetically referred to the falling water as white coal.
I love that phrase, white coal. It perfectly captures how they viewed the river as an infinite natural fuel source that was just cleaner than the black coal they were dragging out of the Pennsylvania hills.
Exactly. And the mechanics are elegant in their simplicity, but terrifying in their scale.
Let's hear it.
The concrete dam acts as a physical barrier that raises the river level by 53 feet. This difference in height between the water behind the dam and the water below the dam is called the head.
The head. Got it.
The higher the head, the more potential energy the water has.
Okay, so deep inside the massive concrete powerhouse, there are these heavily engineered tunnels called penstocks.
Mm-hmm.
And when the operators open the massive steel gates, gravity violently forces the water down through these penstocks.
At the bottom of the penstock, the Russian water slams into a turbine.
Right.
The turbine is connected by a massive vertical steel shaft to a generator located on the floor above it. The sheer force of the water pushes against the blades of the turbine, causing it to spin rapidly.
Which spins the shaft.
Which spins a massive electromagnetic rotor inside a stator in the generator. As the magnetic fields rotate past coils of copper wire, they induce an electrical current. Motion becomes electricity.
But the turbines at Safe Harbor are not just standard water wheels. They installed Kaplan turbines.
Ah, yes.
At the time they were built, they were the largest in physical dimensions ever constructed in the United States.
The Kaplan turbine is an absolute marvel of fluid dynamics invented by an Austrian professor named Victor Kaplan.
Why are they so special?
Older turbine designs were essentially fixed shapes. They worked incredibly efficiently if the water flow and the head pressure were perfectly constant. But, as we know, the Susquehanna River is wildly inconsistent.
Right, so if the water level drops during a drought, a fixed turbine suddenly becomes sluggish and inefficient.
Exactly. The genius of the Kaplan turbine is that it doesn't have fixed blades. It looks and functions very much like an airplane propeller, and crucially, it has adjustable pitch blades.
Oh, that's smart.
Yeah, inside the massive hub of the turbine, there are complex hydraulic mechanisms that can physically rotate the angle of the 5 massive blades while the entire unit is spinning in the water.
So just like an airplane pilot adjusts the pitch of the propellers to take a bigger or smaller bite out of the air, depending on their altitude and speed, the operators at Safe Harbor can change the angle of the turbine blades to take the perfect bite out of the water.
Precisely.
Whether the river is raging from a spring melt or trickling during a summer drought, the Kaplan turbine adjusts its geometry to extract the absolute maximum efficiency from the flow.
It's beautiful engineering. Each of the original 5 main turbines installed at Safe Harbor was capable of delivering 42,500 horsepower.
Jeez.
And they were geared to spin at a highly precise 109.1 revolutions per minute.
That is almost 2 full rotations every second. Just picture a massive 5-bladed steel propeller buried deep inside a concrete bunker, spinning that fast under the crushing weight of the Susquehanna. It's awesome.
It is.
But the electrical engineering of what they generate is where this story takes a really strange turn.
You are referring to the Amtrak anomaly.
Yes. Not all the electricity generated at Safe Harbor is identical. The station has 12 main generating units today. 10 of them do exactly what you would expect from a modern power plant. They generate standard 60 hertz, 3-phase alternating current.
Right, the standard grid.
Yeah, this is the standard lifeblood of the American electrical grid. It goes into the substations, gets stepped down, and powers your refrigerator, your lights, and your television.
But units 1 and 2 are entirely different beasts. They are connected to single-phase generators specifically designed to produce power at 25 hertz.
25 hertz.
And the full customer for that specific power is the railroad system.
I have to pause here because the physics of this are wild. Why would a train need a completely different frequency of electricity than a house?
It comes down to the limitations of early 20th century electrical engineering, specifically regarding massive electric motors. When the Pennsylvania Railroad began electrifying its main lines, they used massive series-wound alternating current motors to drive the locomotive wheels.
And these motors have to pull a train weighing thousands of tons from a dead stop, so the torque required is astronomical.
Yes, exactly. And if you try to run those massive early AC motors on a high frequency like 60 hertz, you run into two major problems.
What happens?
First, the rapidly changing magnetic fields create massive inductive reactance, which acts like resistance, making the motors highly inefficient and causing them to overheat.
Ouch.
Second, the rapid switching causes severe destructive sparking at the brushes and commutator where the electricity transfers to the spinning rotor.
It would literally burn the motor up.
Exactly. But by dropping the frequency down to 25 hertz, meaning the alternating current switches direction less than half as fast, the inductive reactance plummets.
Oh, I see.
The motors run cooler, they generate far more low-end starting torque, and the sparking is minimized. Furthermore, transmitting 25 hertz power over long distances via overhead wires results in less voltage drop than 60 hertz.
So Safe Harbor was built with two massive generators dedicated entirely to making this weird low-frequency power. They run dedicated transmission lines directly from the dam to railroad substations in Parksburg, Royalton, and specifically to Amtrak's massive substation in Perryville, Maryland.
They do. And the plant even features a massive motor generator frequency converter.
Oh, what?
It is a brilliant piece of mechanical arbitrage. If the trains are sitting idle in the middle of the night and Amtrak doesn't need all that 25 hertz power, Safe Harbor can use the 25 hertz generator to power an electric motor, which spins a 60 hertz generator, feeding power back to the public grid.
That is so clever.
Right. Conversely, if the river is low, but a massive freight train needs to climb a grade and requires a massive spike in 25 hertz power, the converter runs in reverse, pulling standard grid power and mechanically translating it into train power.
A hydroelectric dam in rural Pennsylvania is actively acting as the mechanical heartbeat for trains rolling through Maryland.
It's all connected.
The interconnectedness is staggering. But to keep those turbines spinning and those trains moving, the engineers had to reckon with the ghosts of the past. They had to remember what happened to the ironworks in 1904.
They had to battle the ice and the debris.
Yeah.
A river that drains 27,000 square miles, carries an unfathomable amount of trash, shattered trees, and, in winter, millions of tons of ice.
And if a massive tree trunk gets sucked into a penstock, it will shatter a Kaplan turbine blade.
Or if ice jams against the gates, the sheer pressure will tear the steel apart.
So they engineered a heavily fortified defense system.
They did. First, they built a massive rock-filled dike and a 1,500-foot-long concrete skimmer wall perfectly parallel to the river's flow.
Okay, what does that do?
This essentially created a protected harbor, a forebay, right in front of the powerhouse, separating the delicate intakes from the violent main channel.
But floating debris could still drift in, right?
It could. So they added a curtain wall. This is a massive concrete barrier that extends from the surface of the water down to a depth of 15 feet.
Oh, I see. Since most ice and trash floats at or near the surface, this curtain wall physically blocks it, acting as a bumper that forces the debris to slide past the powerhouse and over the main spillway dam instead.
Exactly.
But what about the water inside the forebay? In February, the temperature can sit below freezing for weeks. The water right up against the steel gates could freeze solid, locking the mechanisms in place and crushing the steel as the ice expands.
The solution to that is an absolute masterclass in thermodynamics.
Tell me.
They installed an immense air bubbler system. The engineers laid high-pressure metal tubing all along the bottom of the gates and the skimmer wall. Massive compressors pump air into these tubes at 100 pounds of pressure.
And as that high-pressure air escapes through tiny nozzles at the bottom of the river, it creates a massive curtain of rapidly rising bubbles.
Right. And it does two things. First, the violent agitation of the water makes it much harder for ice crystals to link together and form a solid sheet.
Makes sense.
Second, water is heaviest at about 39 degrees Fahrenheit. In a frozen river, the coldest water and the ice are at the surface, while slightly warmer, denser water sits at the bottom.
Oh, so the bubbles mix it up.
Yes. The rising column of bubbles physically drags that warmer bottom water up to the surface, constantly melting the ice right at the face of the steel gates.
It is an invisible thermal shield made of bubbles.
It's brilliant.
But generating the power and protecting the turbines is only half the battle.
Yeah.
You still have to get that electricity to the factories in Baltimore, over 50 miles away. And the transmission engineering required to do that introduced an entirely new, terrifying problem.
the conductor galloping.
Yes.
Power leaves the generators at a relatively low voltage of 13,800 volts. To push electricity over long distances efficiently, you must step the voltage up. Safe Harbor utilized massive transformer banks to crank the voltage all the way up to 230,000 volts.
They transmitted this massive voltage using heavy, steel-reinforced aluminum cables strung high in the air atop massive steel towers. But the engineers ran into this phenomenon known as conductor galloping, and it is horrifying.
It really is. It occurs during winter sleet storms. Rain falls, hits the sub-freezing metal cables, and instantly freezes. Over hours, this builds up a thick layer of solid ice.
And in the early days, engineers found that the ice didn't form a perfect cylinder. Wind blowing the freezing rain against the wire caused the ice to form an asymmetrical teardrop shape.
Exactly. The ice literally turns the power cable into an aerodynamic wing, an airfoil.
Which is so crazy.
Yeah, as the strong winter winds blow across this newly formed ice wing, it generates aerodynamic lift. The massive, heavy cable begins to bounce and oscillate in the wind.
And then the temperature rises just a single degree.
Just enough.
The ice gripping the cable begins to melt and lose its grip. Suddenly, thousands of pounds of heavy ice crack and fall off the cable all at once. Released from that massive weight, the highly tensioned steel core cable violently snaps upward like a giant rubber band.
And here's the problem. In the early designs of transmission lines, engineers strung the individual phases of the circuit vertically.
One above the other.
Right, one cable directly above another, separated by 10 or 15 feet.
So when the bottom cable snaps upward, it travels 15 feet into the air and violently smashes into the highly charged cable directly above it.
Which creates a massive explosive short circuit, the breakers trip, and the entire city of Baltimore loses power in the middle of a freezing winter storm.
The engineers at Safe Harbor analyzed this galloping phenomenon and realized they couldn't stop the ice, and they couldn't stop the wind.
No, you can't.
So they completely redesigned the towers. Instead of stacking the cables vertically, they designed massive cross arms to string the cables perfectly horizontally. They spread the cables out across a dizzying 58-foot wide plane.
By laying them out side by side horizontally, it didn't matter if the cables galloped or violently snapped upward. They were bouncing in parallel. They could never physically touch each other.
It was an elegant structural solution to an aerodynamic nightmare.
It really was.
But before those cables could run to Baltimore, they had to cross the Susquehanna itself. The powerhouse is on the east bank, but Baltimore is to the south and west. They had to span a 5,000-foot gap over an open, windy river gorge.
And you cannot simply string a heavy steel and aluminum cable across 5,000 feet of open air.
No, it would snap.
The tension required to keep it from sagging into the water would snap the metal, and the wind loads during a storm would tear the towers right out of their concrete foundations.
So they needed a stepping stone.
Right.
And they used Ellis Island, the same rocky outcrop in the middle of the river where they had built the concrete mixing plant.
They erected a gargantuan transmission tower right on the island, dividing the river crossing into two manageable 3,000-foot jumps.
But because this tower was the crucial linchpin, and because it carried extra cables for future expansion, its sheer size was staggering.
Huge.
It stood 200 feet high, and the cross arms stretched 110 feet wide. It was an absolute monolith of steel dominating the river.
The dam literally reshaped the geography, and not just the riverbed.
Oh.
The creation of Lake Clark, the 53-foot deep reservoir behind the dam, pushed the water level far beyond the historical banks of the river.
Right into the path of the Pennsylvania Railroad. There was an active, vital rail line running right along the eastern shore. If they filled the lake, the tracks would be under several feet of water.
And you cannot halt the Pennsylvania Railroad.
Absolutely not.
The engineers were tasked with physically lifting 8 miles of active, heavy-duty railroad track, an average of 4 feet higher into the air, while massive steam locomotives continued to run over it every single day.
How is that practically possible? You can't just pick up a train track.
It requires meticulous sequential track jacking.
Track jacking.
Yeah, the railroad crews would go in between passing trains. They used specialized hydraulic jacks to physically lift a long section of the heavy wooden ties and steel rails just a few inches into the air.
Oh, and then they shoveled new crushed rock, the ballast, underneath the ties to support it at the new height.
Exactly. They employed massive tamping machines to violently vibrate and pack the crushed rock under the ties to ensure a solid foundation.
And then they just kept moving.
Then they moved down the line and did it again. Inch by inch, mile by mile, they jacked the entire 8-mile stretch of railroad up 4 feet.
Wow.
And the Pennsylvania Railroad actually took advantage of the disruption. While the dam engineers were paying to lift the tracks, the railroad paid to carve into the hillside to widen the roadbed, successfully double-tracking and straightening the curves of the line to allow for faster, heavier trains.
It was an absolute symphony of heavy engineering, brute force, and brilliant logistics. They conquered the river.
We really did.
But every time you pour 1 million tons of concrete across a dynamic, ancient natural ecosystem, there are profound consequences. What did transforming a violent, rapids-filled floodplain into a placid, 53-foot deep lake actually do to the environment?
And this brings us to the complex reality of ecological trade-offs. Before the dam, the area immediately upstream was known as the Canal Valley. It was a wide, 10-year floodplain. It was characterized by thick woods, difficult horseback terrain, and expansive, marshy wetlands.
And those wetlands were incredibly vibrant, right?
Very vibrant. Because the river flooded so violently and so regularly, it constantly scoured and reshaped the islands, creating highly varied, nutrient-rich habitats that nurtured a massive diversity of terrestrial wildlife and waterfowl.
So when the gates at Safe Harbor closed, the river swallowed that valley. Lake Clark, a 7,360-acre reservoir, permanently inundated the woods and the marshes.
Right.
The upper Conohela Flats were drastically shrunk. A complex terrestrial and marsh ecosystem was obliterated.
But our sources make a very nuanced point about what happened next. It is a concept called ecological substitution.
Right. The environment didn't just die, it shifted.
Yes. While the terrestrial habitat was lost, the flooding of those varied island topographies created something entirely new, a highly valuable freshwater lacustrine, or lake-based habitat.
It was great for fish.
Exactly. Because the flooded land had various shallow shelves, deep drop-offs, and submerged structures, it became an absolute paradise for aquatic life. It fostered a massive bloom of freshwater feeder fish, panfish, and eventually large predatory game fish like bass and walleye.
So we traded a marsh for a thriving lake ecosystem. And incredibly, the birds adapted. The small remnants of the Conohela Flats that remained above the water level became even more vital.
Oh, definitely.
Today, those specific flats are officially designated as an Audubon Important Bird Area.
They serve as a critical, irreplaceable stopover point on the Atlantic Flyway. Millions of migratory shorebirds and waterfowl rely on those mudflats to rest and feed during their exhausting biannual migrations from the Arctic to South America.
And the Safe Harbor Water Power Corporation actually incorporates this into their daily operations.
I do.
Yeah, from April through October, during the peak migration seasons, the dam operators meticulously regulate and constrain the water levels of the massive lake, specifically to keep those vital mudflats exposed for the birds.
That's amazing.
It is a highly managed, active compromise between generating peak demand electricity and protecting international avian migration routes.
However, there was one major ecological crisis caused by the dam that could not be solved by simply lowering the water level.
Right.
And that involved the American shad.
Ah, the shad. So for listeners who aren't marine biologists, the American shad is an anadromous fish.
Like a salmon.
Exactly like a salmon. A shad lives the vast majority of its adult life out in the salty waters of the Atlantic Ocean.
Right.
But every spring, they must migrate up freshwater rivers to spawn and reproduce.
And they don't just pick any river. They are driven by ancient instinct to return to the exact same stretch of the exact same river where they were born.
And for millennia, the Susquehanna River was one of the greatest shad spawning grounds on the eastern seaboard. The fish would swim hundreds of miles upstream.
But when you build a 75-foot-tall, impenetrable wall of solid concrete directly across their ancient migration route, the journey brutally ends.
The fish cannot jump a dam.
No, they cannot. Consequently, the shad population in the Susquehanna plummeted catastrophically.
To rectify this, the engineers at Safe Harbor had to get incredibly creative. They couldn't just tell the fish to adapt. They had to build a mechanism to literally lift the fish over the dam.
The fish elevator.
They built the Safe Harbor Fish Lift.
It is, quite literally, a massive industrial elevator designed exclusively for fish.
It is brilliant. But how do you get a wild fish to voluntarily swim into an elevator?
You use their own instincts against them. Shad are naturally driven to swim against the strongest current they can find because the strongest current leads upstream. The engineers designed a specialized channel at the base of the dam, the tail race, and they pump a highly calculated flow of attraction water through it.
So the fish feel the current.
The migrating shad feel this strong current, follow it, and are funneled directly into a massive swimming pool-sized hopper sitting at the bottom of an elevator shaft.
Wow.
Once enough fish swim into the hopper, a massive steel gate drops down behind them, trapping them. Then giant electric motors hoist this massive bucket filled with thousands of gallons of water and thrashing fish, 75 feet straight up into the air to the top of the dam.
Once it reaches the top, the bucket tips, releasing the water and the fish into a long concrete flume. This flume gently carries them out past the intake screens and releases them into the calm waters of Lake Clark, allowing them to continue their journey north to spawn.
And I love this detail. As the fish are swimming down the flume, there is a glass viewing window.
Really?
Yeah. Scientists actually sit in a specialized room and manually count the American shad as they swim past.
That sounds tedious.
The source author points out how incredibly difficult this is because the water is often cloudy from spring runoff, and the scientists have to rapidly distinguish the shad from all the other random fish and river animals that decided to hitch a free ride on the elevator.
That's hilarious. It is a remarkable multi-million-dollar piece of conservation engineering that has allowed the shad population to begin a slow, highly monitored rebound.
It really is.
But wait, I was reading about this process and a glaring question popped into my head.
What's that?
Okay, the elevator takes them up the dam so they can lay their eggs. How on earth do the adult fish, and eventually the millions of baby fish, get back down the dam to reach the ocean? Do they wait for the elevator to go down?
No, the journey back down is significantly faster and far more violent.
Wow.
They simply swim right into the intakes and go directly through the spinning Kaplan turbines.
They ride the turbines. That sounds like a giant industrial blender. How do they survive?
It sounds terrifying, but the survival rate is actually remarkably high. Because the Kaplan turbines are so massive, remember, they're the largest in the country, and because they rotate relatively slowly at just 109 RPM, there is a tremendous amount of physical space between the 5 blades.
So it's not like a high-speed fan. It's more like navigating a slow-moving revolving door if that door was pushing 1 million gallons of water a minute.
Exactly. The vast majority of the fish are swept cleanly through the massive gaps between the blades by the sheer volume and speed of the water.
Wow.
It is a terrifying water slide, but the mechanics of the turbine allow them to pass through safely and continue down the river to the bay.
It is this exact kind of complex environmental management that has earned Safe Harbor significant modern recognition. The facility hasn't just sat dormant since the 1930s.
Oh no, they've updated it quite a bit.
Yeah, they continually upgraded the generators, and in the 1980s, they completed a massive physical addition to the powerhouse, adding more turbines. Today, Safe Harbor boasts a capacity of over 417.5 megawatts of clean, renewable hydroelectric power, dispatching it seamlessly into the massive PJM interconnection grid that feeds the Mid-Atlantic states.
It is viewed as a premier case study in operational balance. In fact, in May of 2001, President George W. Bush selected the Safe Harbor plant as the backdrop to deliver a major address outlining his national energy policy.
Really? Out of all the places?
Yes. The administration chose the dam specifically because it embodied the ultimate example of government regulators, massive corporate energy producers, and strict environmental conservation groups successfully collaborating to generate necessary power while mitigating ecological damage.
And their environmental stewardship extends beyond just the fish and the birds. That same year, 2001, the operating corporation won a prestigious Governor's Award for Environmental Excellence.
Because of the trash, right?
Yes, because they utilized their specialized cranes and river skimming equipment to physically fish over 11,000 tons of debris, trash, and shattered timber out of the river, recycling almost all of it.
That's a massive amount of waste.
They removed 11,000 tons of garbage from the watershed that would have otherwise choked the Chesapeake Bay.
It is a facility that has aggressively evolved far beyond its desperate Depression-era roots. Yet, if you look at the physical structure itself, it remains a stunning homage to the era in which it was born.
That is something we cannot overlook, the architecture.
It's beautiful.
When we think of modern dams, we often picture brutalist, ugly, gray concrete bunkers. But the original 1930s powerhouse at Safe Harbor is a beautiful piece of early modern industrial design. It was meticulously constructed using warm, ochre-colored brick.
And the main turbine hall is breathtaking. It is a soaring, cavernous, vertical space. The architects clearly designed it in the grand tradition of the massive metropolitan train stations of the era.
It really looks like a train station.
It features continuous, 60-foot-high, south-facing windows. These massive panes of glass flood the interior turbine deck and the polished steel machinery with warm, natural sunlight.
It feels like a cathedral dedicated to industry. You can actually see the architectural shift when you look at the 1986 edition.
Yeah, the newer part is different.
The newer section is functionally identical, but architecturally, it uses two separate levels of smaller individual windows. It is practical, but it loses that soaring, majestic verticality of the original 1930s hall.
The original structure was built in an era when massive infrastructure was meant to be a permanent, awe-inspiring monument to human capability.
So when we step back and look at the totality of this story, what does Safe Harbor actually represent? When you drive across the bridge today and look down the gorge at this massive wall of concrete, it is incredibly difficult to comprehend the layers of history, failure, and triumph stacked beneath it.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Safe Harbor is the ultimate proof that human ingenuity eventually realized that you cannot brute force a river of this magnitude. For over a century, brilliant, wealthy men tried to force the Susquehanna to be a gentle commercial highway. They dug canals, they built locks, they founded seaports in landlocked cities, and the river crushed every single attempt.
It shattered their bridges, it washed away their investments, and it literally crushed their towns with ice.
The genius of Safe Harbor was realizing that the violence of the river wasn't the problem, it was the solution.
Exactly.
By building the dam, we stopped fighting the river's unnavigable fall line and instead harnessed it, trading the dream of wooden boats for the reality of vital, life-sustaining electricity.
It is a staggering achievement. The Safe Harbor Dam is a monument built directly on top of the ancient hunting grounds and kitchen fires of the Susquehannocks. It stands sentry over the watery graveyard of a delusional seaport, and it casts its shadow over the icy, buried ruins of the booziest iron-puddling town in Lancaster County.
It's seen it all.
It is a marvel of Great Depression grit, fueled by incredibly cheap materials, thousands of desperate men, and the kind of miraculous engineering weather luck that you simply cannot plan for.
No, you really can't.
But as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with one final lingering thought. Before they closed the steel gates and allowed the river to flood the valley and form Lake Clark, Dr. Kazow dug into the muddy banks. He unearthed the intricately carved bone tools and the ancient clay pots of the Susquehannock people. To them, those pots were cutting-edge technology. They were the tools of the people who ruled the river before us.
Right.
Today, we stand on the observation deck and look down at this 5,000-foot-long concrete leviathan. We watch it spinning its massive 42,500 horsepower steel Kaplan turbines, and we view it with total certainty as a permanent, immovable, eternal fixture of the landscape.
But we know that's not exactly true.
No. History tells us that the Susquehanna River has already violently erased the town of Safe Harbor from the map once before. Geology is patient, and water always wins.
It always does.
So, what will the archaeologists of the deep future find at the bottom of the Susquehanna Gorge 10,000 years from now? When the concrete eventually crumbles and the river reclaims its gorge, will our mighty, invincible steel turbines, buried deep in the river mud, look just like those ancient clay pots to the people who come next?
That is quite the thought.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the layers of history hiding right beneath the surface of the water, and we will see you next time.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of the Uncharted Lancaster podcast. If you enjoyed the episode, be sure to subscribe and leave a rating or review wherever you listen. It really helps more people discover the show. For more fascinating local history, visit unchartedlancaster.com. And if you'd like to go deeper, check out one of Adam Zern's books at unchartedlancaster.com/books. Until next time, keep exploring.